I still remember the exact moment everything changed in Pine Ridge Estates. And it began with a question that froze me in place. Why would a grown woman in authority scream at an 82-year-old man who was simply watering his flowers? It was one of those scenes that makes you question humanity itself. The sun was burning overhead, the kind of harsh afternoon heat that made the pavement shimmer. When I stepped out onto my porch and spotted Harold Dawson standing in his front yard with his old green hose hanging loosely from his hand. Water dripped rhythmically onto the dirt, darkening patches of soil around his rose bushes. His back was slightly bent, his shoulders thin, and his hands trembling, not from age, but from fear. And that fear had one source: Karen Whitfield, our HOA president, standing just a few feet from him and screaming like he had committed some unforgivable crime. Her voice cut through the quiet neighborhood with a sharpness that made my stomach twist. She was yelling about rules, fines, compliance, words she threw like weapons. But none of it made sense. Harold wasn't doing anything wrong. He was watering the roses he had planted with his late wife decades ago. I could hear his voice cracking as he tried to explain himself, but Karen didn't give him a chance. Her perfectly styled blonde hair barely moved as she leaned closer to him, jabbing a finger toward the ground like she was pointing out evidence from a crime scene. In that moment, something inside me snapped, because there was no version of this situation where her behavior made sense or could be justified. I stepped off my porch and walked toward them, each step heavy with disbelief. The closer I got, the more wrong the whole moment felt, like this wasn't just a neighborly disagreement, but the surface of something much darker. The smell of wet soil mixed with the metallic scent of heated garden tools lying nearby, and I could hear Harold struggling to breathe evenly. His hose slipped from his hand entirely when he noticed me approaching, and the stream of water arced awkwardly toward the sidewalk. I cleared my throat and tried to keep my voice steady as I asked what was going on, but before Harold could respond, Karen spun toward me with a glare so sharp it felt like she was physically cutting the space between us. "Interference," she hissed, as if the word alone was enough to place me on trial. "You are interfering with HOA enforcement, and that is a direct violation of policy." Her words hit me with a coldness I didn't expect. I wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not for simply walking up to check on a neighbor. For a brief moment, I imagined how many times she had used that exact tone on other residents, on people who maybe didn't have the courage or strength to push back. I could feel Harold's eyes on me, silently asking for help, but Karen's authority felt like a wall she believed no one could climb. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply stayed with Harold until she finally walked away, heels clicking like a judge leaving her bench. That evening, as I walked back home, I kept replaying the scene in my mind, wondering what kind of person found satisfaction in intimidating someone twice her age. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe it would all blow over. But the truth is, it didn't. It escalated faster than I ever expected, because before I even finished my dinner, I stepped outside to toss the trash, and froze when I saw it. A warning notice taped to my door. Standing on my porch that night with the warning notice trembling in my hand, I kept asking myself the same question. Why was I being punished for helping a helpless old man? The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the ink itself carried some kind of threat. It accused me of obstructing HOA enforcement, a phrase that made me laugh for a second before the seriousness of it settled in. I hadn't obstructed anything. I'd simply stepped forward when I saw an elderly man being verbally attacked. But as I read the notice again under the porch light, a cold realization crept up my spine. Karen wasn't just angry. She was targeting me. Confusion hit me first, a swirling fog in my chest that made everything feel unreal. I tried to replay every second of the confrontation earlier, searching for something I might have said or done that could have triggered this level of hostility. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Karen didn't need a reason. She never did. She ruled Pine Ridge Estates with a kind of silent, oppressive power that everyone felt but no one wanted to challenge. People avoided her not because she was right, but because she was relentless. She was the kind of HOA president who believed authority was something to be flexed, not respected. Frustration replaced confusion, tightening in my shoulders and jaw. What kind of community punished someone for compassion? What kind of leader threatened residents instead of guiding them? I had seen glimpses of Karen's behavior before, but I had never been directly on the receiving end. Now, with my name printed on that notice in bold letters, I understood why neighbors whispered about her instead of confronting her. She had created an environment where fear traveled faster than truth. But fear wasn't the only thing gnawing at me. There was something deeper: guilt. After the notice appeared, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Harold standing there with the hose slipping from his hand, looking more fragile than any man his age should have to look. I wondered if my stepping in had made things worse for him. Karen didn't strike me as the type to let go of grudges. She struck me as someone who punished anyone who didn't bow to her authority. And Harold, with his quiet voice and soft heart, was an easy target. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table and found myself thinking about Harold's garden. He once told me he planted those roses with his wife, Margaret, nearly 40 years ago. Every bloom was a memory, every petal a reminder of the life they built together. After she passed, tending to that garden became his ritual, his way of keeping her close. It wasn't just dirt and flowers to him. It was the last piece of her he still had. And now Karen wanted to dismantle it in the name of compliance. The next morning, I stepped outside hoping to see Harold doing what he always did, watering his roses, humming softly as he worked. But his yard was quiet. The hose was coiled neatly on the ground, untouched. The roses looked dry, leaning slightly as if waiting for him. My guilt twisted deeper. I walked over to check on him, but before I could even knock, his daughter opened the door with a worried expression. She didn't waste time with small talk. Her voice was low, serious and heavy with something that made my chest tighten. She told me Harold was considering giving up gardening entirely. In the days that followed, one question kept clawing at the back of my mind. Why was Karen so obsessed with destroying something as innocent as Harold's rose garden? It didn't make sense. It wasn't harming anyone. It wasn't blocking anything. It wasn't violating any rule that a reasonable person would care about. Yet every morning when the sun broke over Pine Ridge Estates, Karen appeared like clockwork, strutting across Harold's lawn with a clipboard in hand and a phone always ready to take pictures. It was as if she woke up every day with a mission to break a man who barely had the strength to stand against a light breeze. I watched from my window the first few mornings, hoping she would get bored and move on, but it only intensified. She crouched down near his rose beds, photographed individual petals, measured the distance between his bushes, leaned so close that the flowers themselves seemed to pull back from her. Every click of her camera felt like a small act of violence. Harold would watch from his porch, shoulders hunched as if bracing for another blow he had no power to stop. Then she turned her attention to me. It started subtly at first. A quick photo of my mailbox, another of my driveway. But soon she was pacing in front of my house, longer than necessary, snapping pictures with the cold precision of someone gathering ammunition. Each new photograph added a new layer of pressure, and the anxiety that had been simmering inside me from the first warning notice began to rise. I could feel myself slipping into a constant state of alertness. Every morning, I opened my blinds cautiously, half expecting another violation taped to my door. It made me angry, angrier than I had felt in years. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Neither was Harold, but Karen was treating us like criminals, and with each passing day, it became clearer that her obsession wasn't about rules. It was about control, about dominance, about showing us how small she believed we were under her authority. And the worst part was knowing how easily someone like her could twist a situation if she wanted to. So I decided I needed my own protection. I started documenting her actions, just like she documented ours. I kept a notebook with dates, times, descriptions. I recorded her voice when she made comments under her breath. and I took pictures of her taking pictures. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was preparing for some kind of battle I didn't ask for. But I knew I couldn't rely on common sense or fairness to stop her. So I reminded myself of something important that most homeowners forget. We have the legal right to request written authority for any citation or HOA action. If she wanted to threaten me, she would have to prove every accusation on paper. Still, the anxiety never left. It hovered around me like a shadow. The turning point came when Harold knocked on my door one afternoon. His eyes were tired, his hands twisted nervously together. He told me Karen had confronted him again, this time demanding that he remove his rose bushes entirely because they were non-compliant with community landscaping standards. I felt my stomach clench. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was destruction, and before either of us could even process what that meant, Harold's shaky hand reached into his pocket and pulled out the newest development, a formal violation letter. This one stated, in bold, unyielding language, that his entire garden had to be torn out. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I was jolted awake by a low rumbling sound, deep enough to shake my windows. For a moment I thought it was a delivery truck, but then came the grinding noise of brakes, the clatter of metal tools, and the muffled thud of heavy boots hitting pavement. I pulled back my curtain and froze. A crew of unfamiliar men had stepped out of a large landscaping truck, each of them carrying shovels, pickaxes, or gas-powered cutters. Their silhouettes moved through the dim morning light like figures in some tense, cinematic scene. And they weren't just gathering their equipment. They were walking straight toward Harold's yard. My heart dropped. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I didn't think. I didn't question. I just bolted out my front door, not even bothering with shoes. The cold concrete under my feet shocked me awake as I sprinted toward Harold's driveway. The smell of diesel from the truck hung heavy in the air, mixing with the early morning dampness. The metal tools scraped loudly as the workers dragged them across the ground, preparing for something that felt all too permanent. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, breathless as I reached the edge of the yard. Before any of the men could answer, Karen stepped out from behind them with a clipboard in her hand, her expression calm, almost smug. Her perfectly pressed blouse didn't match the chaos unfolding around her. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment. She took a slow step toward me and lifted her chin with exaggerated confidence. "Mandatory cleanup," she said as if announcing the weather. "The HOA has ordered removal of all non-compliant vegetation." I stared at her, stunned. "It's 6 in the morning, Karen, and these are roses. Harold's roses. You can't just send a demolition crew onto his property." She didn't flinch. "He received a violation. This is the consequence of non-compliance." Behind her, the workers continued preparing, revving machines, scraping metal against metal. The sound sliced through the silence of the waking neighborhood. And then I noticed Harold standing on his porch, tears running silently down his cheeks, his old hands gripping the railing like he needed it to keep himself upright. Seeing him cry, this man who had survived more life than most of us could imagine, ignited something fierce inside me. "You're not touching those flowers," I said, stepping between the workers and the rose beds. My voice trembled, not from fear, but from fury. "Not until I see written authorization." Karen let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You don't give orders here." "I'm requesting my legal right to see documentation," I said. "If this is an HOA action, show me the paperwork, approved signatures, a dated directive. Until then, they're not moving an inch." The tension cracked through the morning air like electricity. The workers hesitated, uncertain, glancing at Karen for direction. She glared at me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Something dark, something boiling with resentment. The moment stretched tight, heavy with the knowledge that one wrong move could escalate everything beyond repair. And then, without a word, Karen reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and lifted it to her ear. She wasn't calling the landscapers. She wasn't calling the HOA board. She was calling the sheriff. When Karen dialed the sheriff, a strange calm washed over me. One that didn't come from confidence. but from the realization that whatever happened next would expose the truth behind her actions. Still, as the patrol car rolled up, gravel crunching under its tires, the question hammered in my chest. Would the sheriff believe the truth, or would he fall for the lies Karen was so eager to spin? The air felt thick with tension as he stepped out, adjusting his belt, scanning the scene with the slow, measured eyes of someone who had seen far too many neighborhood disputes escalate into something much uglier. Before I could take a single step, Karen practically sprinted toward him, waving her clipboard like a badge of honor. "Officer," she began, her voice dripping with urgency, "this man is obstructing an authorized HOA cleanup. He's being hostile, aggressive, and preventing workers from carrying out safety-mandated tasks." She gestured dramatically toward me, as if presenting a criminal she had bravely apprehended. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. I just watched her perform, spinning her narrative with the confidence of someone who had gotten away with this routine for years. But the sheriff didn't immediately respond. His eyes drifted past her and settled on the crew, who stood awkwardly with their tools half lowered, clearly unsure of what they were supposed to do. That hesitation gave me the courage to step forward. "Officer," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "I have documentation I'd like to show you." I reached into my pocket slowly, aware of every movement. The sheriff nodded cautiously. "I have photos, timestamps, and written violations that contradict everything she's claiming." I handed over the printed notices, along with the pictures I had taken of Karen conducting her daily inspections. He studied them longer than I expected. The only sounds around us were the engines idling, the soft sputter of tools cooling off, and somewhere behind me, Harold's faint, shaky breathing. The sheriff's expression changed as he flipped through each page. Lines of confusion, then concern, then something closer to irritation. But it wasn't directed at me. Finally, he turned to Karen. "Do you have written authorization for this cleanup? Signed directives? Anything from the board approving property entry?" The question hit her like a slap. Her posture stiffened, the fake confidence draining from her face. "It's implied authority," she snapped. "I'm the HOA president. That's all the authorization needed." "No, it isn't," the sheriff replied firmly. "Not for destructive action on private property." The workers overheard him and immediately took a collective step back. Tools were lowered, engines switched off, engines cooling with sharp metallic clicks. None of them wanted to be part of something illegal, not with a sheriff standing 3 feet away. Relief washed through me so intensely it left me lightheaded. But it wasn't complete relief, because right behind it came fear. Fear of what Karen would do now that she had been publicly challenged, exposed, and blocked. Someone like her didn't accept loss quietly, and as much as I wanted to celebrate this moment, a cold heaviness settled in my gut. "Until you have proper authorization," the sheriff continued, "no one touches this property. Understood?" Karen didn't answer. Not immediately. She just stared at him, then at me, eyes burning with something venomous. When she finally walked past, her heels striking hard against the pavement, she slowed just enough to lean in close to me. "You won't survive what comes next," she whispered. And she meant every word. That night, after Karen whispered her threat, sleep became impossible. I sat at my dining table with every document I had collected scattered in front of me, lit only by a small desk lamp that threw long shadows across the pages. My mind kept circling the same question. What was Karen hiding that she thought no one would ever discover? People don't lash out the way she did unless they have something to protect, something fragile, dangerous, or deeply incriminating. And if she was willing to send a crew before sunrise to destroy an old man's rose garden, then whatever she was hiding had to be far bigger than a complaint about landscaping. So I stayed up, digging through HOA bylaws line by line. The more I read, the more the rules blurred together, a twisting maze of obligations, permissions, and procedures. But then patterns began to appear, tiny inconsistencies that felt like loose threads waiting to be pulled. Some fines didn't match the guidelines. Some procedures lacked proper signatures, and some citations, including Harold's, had timelines that made no sense. It was subtle, but it was there. A system being manipulated, not followed. Around midnight, I stepped outside for fresh air, only to find my neighbor, Greg, walking his dog. When he saw me, he hesitated, then approached slowly. "I heard what happened this morning," he said. His voice was low, cautious. "You're not the only one she's messed with." Then he told me about the fines he'd received for having improper exterior lighting, fines that mysteriously disappeared when he threatened to get an attorney involved. Another neighbor stepped out a few minutes later, overhearing our conversation. She described months of intimidation over her driveway color, something no one had ever complained about before. One by one, stories emerged, whispered in the dark as if Karen herself could hear us. There was a pattern, targeting certain residents, issuing questionable fines, using fear to keep everyone in line. And suddenly, this wasn't just about Harold's roses or my warning notice. This was about power, abuse, and possibly something more dangerous beneath the surface. That realization pushed me back inside with renewed determination. If Karen was twisting the rulebook to fit her agenda, there had to be a trail. HOA leaders are required to keep transparent financial records. It's a right many homeowners forget they have. The right to inspect financials, including invoices, expenditures, and vendor contracts. So I sent an official email requesting access to the HOA budget and recent vendor payments. I didn't expect to get them immediately, but even sending that email felt like crossing a line Karen never wanted anyone to touch. 2 days later, I received partial records. Not everything, but enough to see red flags. Landscaping expenses had nearly doubled in the past year, and buried within those invoices were charges for mandatory cleanups, each linked to the same company. A company I had never seen used before Karen became president. A company that, as far as online records showed, had almost no real presence. My stomach twisted as it clicked together. Harold's garden wasn't a mess she wanted to tidy. It was an opportunity. For profit, for leverage, or for something even worse. The truth was bigger than harassment. It was shifting into corruption. A few evenings later, as I was leaving my house, someone stepped out from behind a parked car. It was Tom, one of the quieter HOA board members. His eyes darted around nervously before he approached me. Without a word, he pressed a file into my hands. "This will change everything," he whispered. When Tom handed me that file under the streetlight, my hands shook before I even opened it. Something about the weight of it felt wrong. Too heavy for just a stack of papers, too important to be passed in such secrecy. As soon as I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, I sat at my kitchen table and flipped it open. The first page was enough to make my breath catch. What dark secret was hidden inside that file? More than I was prepared for. The documents revealed a pattern so bold, so reckless, it was hard to believe someone had gotten away with it for this long. There were questionable transactions listed as emergency property maintenance, yet none of the addresses matched properties that needed repairs. Several approvals lacked the necessary signatures from board members, replaced instead with scribbles that looked suspiciously similar, almost like someone had forged them to push payments through. And then there were the landscaping charges. Dozens of them. Inflated costs for simple work, outrageous fees for imaginary cleanups, and repeat payments to the same obscure company I had flagged earlier. My pulse quickened as I read line after line. Almost every mandatory cleanup coincided with a violation Karen had issued. It didn't take a detective to see the pattern. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was manufacturing reasons to funnel money into a business likely tied to her. Every rosebush she targeted, every mailbox she criticized, every strip of grass she measured might have been an excuse to create another invoice. The realization hit me like a punch. Harold's garden wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a profit opportunity. Betrayal washed over me like cold water. This wasn't the neighborhood I thought I lived in. It wasn't the HOA I believed was meant to protect property values and fairness. And Karen, who positioned herself as the guardian of community order, was exploiting her position with precision and greed. But the betrayal wasn't only about the money. It was about what she had put Harold through, what she had put countless neighbors through. It was about fear, manipulation, and the way she had turned our homes into tools for her own gain. Shock quickly gave way to determination. I couldn't stay silent anymore. This file wasn't just information, it was ammunition. It was a chance to expose her, a chance to stop her from hurting anyone else. So I started reaching out to neighbors, quietly, carefully. I spoke to Greg, then Maria, then a handful of others who had their own stories of Karen's intimidation. We met after dark in garages, on porches, in driveways where prying eyes couldn't see. Some were hesitant, others angry, but all of them felt the same thing: relief that someone was finally doing something. Together, we began compiling our experiences, cross-referencing dates and fines with the suspicious invoices. The picture became clearer with every conversation. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a personality conflict. It was an organized pattern of exploitation, and as we worked, a plan formed, a plan to confront Karen publicly at the upcoming HOA meeting, to lay out every inconsistency, every forged approval, every inflated expense, to bring the truth into the light where she couldn't twist it or hide it. But just as hope began to build, just as I felt the first spark of victory, there came a sudden, sharp knock at my front door, a knock that didn't feel accidental. When I looked through the peephole, my blood ran cold. Karen was standing there, late at night, alone. When I opened the door and saw Karen standing alone on my porch, illuminated only by the dim glow of the streetlight, a chill moved through me. Why did she show up at my house after dark? She didn't look angry the way she had earlier that week. She looked controlled, calculating, like someone who had rehearsed the moment in her mind before stepping out into the night. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her sharp stare didn't waver as I stepped into the doorway. "Mark," she said, her voice smooth in a way that unsettled me even more than her shouting ever had. "We need to talk." Every instinct told me not to let her inside, so I didn't move from the doorway. "About what?" Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're involving yourself in matters you don't understand. And if you keep pushing, you're going to regret it." "I don't want that for you." It was psychological intimidation. Calculated, personal, precise. The kind of threat meant to burrow into your thoughts and stay there. I didn't respond. Not immediately. I could feel my heart thumping hard enough to hear it. I'd confronted her before, but this was different. This wasn't Karen the HOA president. This was Karen the manipulator, the puppeteer, the woman used to controlling people long before they realized they were being controlled. She stepped closer. "You think exposing me will make you some kind of hero?" Her voice dropped, sharp as broken glass. "But it will ruin your life, Mark. Your reputation, your peace, your place in this neighborhood. You don't know what you're starting." I swallowed hard, fear threading itself through my ribs, and for a split second, I wondered if she was right. If confronting her meant putting a target on my back forever. If standing up for Harold and everyone else was worth losing the quiet, simple life I had built. Fear battled with responsibility in a way that made my thoughts blur. But then I remembered Harold's trembling hands, his dried roses, the way he looked at the ground as if waiting for someone to save something dear to him. I remembered the neighbors who whispered their stories with relief that someone finally listened. And with that, fear loosened its grip. "Karen," I said quietly, "homeowners cannot be punished for attending or participating in HOA meetings. It's in the bylaws. And I'm not breaking any rules by asking questions." That hit her. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes flickered. The mask slipped for half a breath before she forced it back into place. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone shifting from threatening to coldly final. "A mistake you won't be able to undo." But I didn't back down. Standing there on my porch, I felt something shift inside me, a resolve settling like stone. Whatever consequences came, silence would no longer be one of them. She wasn't just abusing power. She was burying truth, and I couldn't allow it. Without inviting her to say another word, I closed the door slowly, firmly. The moment the latch clicked, I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Then I turned back to the dining table where the file lay open. I reorganized the evidence, refined my notes, rehearsed what I needed to present. Every second felt heavier, but also clearer. The meeting was days away, and everything needed to be perfect. Except it wasn't days away. Just as I finished assembling the final documents, my phone buzzed with a new HOA email alert. Karen had called an emergency meeting. One day earlier than scheduled. The next evening, as I walked toward the community center for the emergency meeting, one question kept circling in my mind like a warning I couldn't shake. Would the board listen to me, or let Karen silence the truth? The parking lot was already overflowing. Cars lining the street in a way I had never seen for any HOA gathering. Neighbors filed in quietly, exchanging anxious glances, their footsteps soft but tense. Something about the air felt heavy, charged, as though everyone knew something explosive was about to unfold. Inside, the meeting room was packed. People stood along the walls, whispered among themselves, or sat rigid in folding chairs as if waiting for a verdict. Karen sat at the front of the room, her expression polished into a mask of calm authority. She held the gavel lightly in her hand, tapping it against the table with just enough pressure to send a subtle message. She was in control. "Meeting is now in session," she announced, cutting the room into silence. "We have limited time, so we will not be entertaining unrelated complaints." It was her first attempt to shut me down before I even opened my mouth. I raised my hand. "I have something that needs to be addressed." Karen didn't look at me. "Not tonight, Mark." The room shifted. People looked between us, confused and uneasy. A few whispered. One board member adjusted his glasses and frowned. I stood, my heart pounding but my resolve stronger than her command. "With respect," I said, projecting my voice, "what I have concerns financial practices, violation procedures, and misuse of authority. It is absolutely relevant." Karen's head snapped toward me, her eyes sharp with warning. "Sit down. You're not on the agenda." But I didn't sit. Instead, I placed the thick folder of evidence on the table in front of her. The sound echoed through the room like a crack of thunder. A murmur spread through the crowd. I opened the folder, pulling out the first page. A questionable landscaping invoice linked to Harold's violation. Then another. An approval form missing signatures. Then another. Duplicate charges for imaginary cleanups. I revealed each document slowly, methodically, letting the weight of every piece settle over the room. With each page, more whispers rippled through the audience. Some neighbors leaned forward. Others shook their heads in disbelief. "This isn't speculation," I continued. "These invoices, these approvals, these fines, they show a pattern. A pattern of targeted harassment and financial exploitation." Karen slammed the gavel down. "Enough. You have no authority to accuse the board." "I'm accusing you," I said, meeting her stare head on. "Every irregularity traces back to actions you initiated." The room reacted instantly. Gasps, sharp whispers. A few people turned toward Karen with expressions that were no longer filled with fear but with suspicion. Her facade cracked. Not fully, but enough to reveal a flicker of panic. "This is nonsense," she snapped. "Fabricated, misinterpreted, taken out of context." But the neighbors no longer looked convinced, and the board, those who had sat quietly for months, finally shifted uneasily in their seats. Cracks were forming in the wall of authority she had built around herself. Her control was slipping. Before she could regain it, one of the board members, Tom, the same man who had given me the file, cleared his throat. "I have something I need to add," he said, standing slowly, his voice trembling but firm. "Something the board has not yet discussed publicly." Every head in the room turned toward him. And then he said the words that froze the entire room. "I have additional evidence." When Tom stood and announced that he had additional evidence, the entire room seemed to freeze. For months, maybe years, Karen had operated with unchecked authority. But now, with every eye in Pine Ridge Estates locked on her, I couldn't stop wondering. Was this the moment Karen's power finally crumbled? Tom adjusted his glasses, his hands shaking slightly, and pulled out a stack of documents far thicker than what he'd given me in secret. "These," he said, voice steadying as he spoke, "are internal records, complaints, and procedural discrepancies that were never addressed. Many of them involve actions taken directly by Karen without board approval." The room erupted with whispers. Karen's face flushed a sharp red. She shot up from her seat so quickly her chair skidded back. "This is absurd," she snapped, eyes darting between the board members. "You're taking his side, over mine, over your own president?" But Tom continued, "We have homeowner complaints that were dismissed without review, fines issued without cause, unauthorized spending, and," he held up another document, "an email where you instructed the landscaping company to prioritize properties belonging only to residents who resisted your directives." Gasps spread through the room like a wave. Karen spun toward him. "You're misinterpreting everything. Those were urgent matters. Emergency maintenance, safety concerns." But her voice cracked, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw panic in her eyes. Real panic. The kind that appears when someone realizes their constructed wall of control is finally splintering. Another board member, Linda, spoke next. "Karen, several of these actions violated protocol. You issued fines without board consent. You approved expenditures outside your authority." She paused, letting the words settle. "And you targeted residents, including our oldest one." Karen shook her head violently. No. This is a setup. You're all being manipulated. She pointed at me with trembling fury, is twisting everything to make me look corrupt." But no one believed her anymore. The board chair cleared his throat. "Karen Whitfield, due to the OI evidence presented tonight and the testimony of multiple residents, the board will immediately vote on suspending you from your position pending a formal investigation." Karen's breathing quickened. "You can't do this. I run this association. I built its standards. You owe me." But the vote had already begun. Hands went up. 1, 2, 3, 4, all except hers. The board chair turned back to her. "The motion passes." The room fell quiet. Then, slowly, a sense of relief rippled through the crowd. Shoulders relaxed. Whispered breaths released. Neighbors who'd lived in fear for years finally looked like they could breathe again. And Harold, sweet, gentle Harold, wiped tears from his eyes. I had never seen him cry before except when Karen tried to destroy his garden. But these tears were different. They were of release, of peace. For the first time since this nightmare began, the neighborhood felt united instead of controlled. The board adjourned the meeting with promises to review every violation issued under Karen, refund wrongful fines, and reevaluate HOA procedures. It wasn't just justice, it was repair. As people stood to leave, Karen remained motionless for a long moment. Then slowly she gathered her papers with shaking hands. Without addressing anyone, she stormed toward the exit. But just before she reached the door, she turned her head sharply, her eyes locking onto mine. There was no shouting this time, no performative rage. Just a cold, silent, burning intent that made the hairs on my neck stand up. And then she was gone. But the message in her stare was unmistakable. She wasn't finished with me. When the board officially suspended Karen, an uneasy silence settled over Pine Ridge Estates. A silence that felt less like calm and more like the moment after a storm when you're still not sure if the sky is truly done raging. I found myself wondering over and over, what would happen now that Karen was gone? For the first time in months, I stepped outside the next morning without bracing for confrontation, but the neighborhood felt unfamiliar, as if the air itself didn't know how to behave without her presence hanging over us. Within days, the HOA began implementing changes so quickly it was almost dizzying. Notices were retracted. Residents received written apologies. Dozens of fines, some years old, were reviewed, dismissed, or refunded. The board scheduled an open meeting to rewrite enforcement procedures, ensuring no single person could wield the kind of unchecked authority Karen had abused. Standing in the community room during that session, I watched neighbors speak freely without pausing to see if Karen was glaring at them from the corner. That alone felt like a victory. Harold's situation changed most profoundly. A board member personally visited him to apologize, and the HOA issued a written guarantee granting his rose garden permanent protection under the community's preservation clause. When I walked by his property that afternoon, I saw him kneeling beside the roses, hands gently brushing the petals as if reacquainting himself with a part of his life he thought he had lost. There was something peaceful in his expression, relief blending with disbelief. But there was more. A week after the vote, a county official arrived to collect documents for a civil review into Karen's financial conduct. The board had forwarded the suspicious invoices, and the county took them seriously. Watching the official carry sealed evidence bags from the HOA office, I felt a heaviness lift from my chest. Karen would finally answer for the damage she caused, not through whisper campaigns and neighborhood fear, but through real accountability. Still, even with justice unfolding, I found myself wrestling with something quieter and more personal. Standing up hadn't been easy. It hadn't been noble or effortless. It had been exhausting, consuming, and frightening in ways I never expected. I had lost sleep, second-guessed myself, and questioned whether pushing forward was worth the cost. But every time I saw Harold smile at his roses, or watched a neighbor walk down the street without glancing nervously over their shoulder, I knew why I'd done it. Standing up to someone like Karen wasn't just about stopping her. It was about reminding myself, and everyone else, that communities don't survive on silence. They survive on people willing to speak when others cannot. On people who refuse to let fear make decisions for them. As the weeks settled into something resembling normal, I allowed myself to breathe again. Not fully. There was still a lingering edge, a slight tension when I passed the spot where Karen had stared me down before storming out. But it was better. Life felt like it was healing. That's why the next morning hit me so hard. I opened my front door to grab the newspaper, expecting nothing unusual. But there, resting carefully on my welcome mat, was a plain white envelope. No name, no return address, just my house number written in a tight, deliberate hand I recognized immediately. It was from Karen. When I picked up that plain white envelope from my doorstep, a chill moved through me so quickly it felt like the air had turned to ice. Why did Karen send me one final letter? The investigation was underway. Her authority had collapsed, and yet somehow I knew she wasn't finished with me. Her handwriting on the front was stiff and sharp, the kind that suggested she wrote with anger pressing down on every stroke. For a moment, I stood frozen, tempted to throw it straight into the trash. But curiosity, or maybe caution, pulled me back inside to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. No greeting, no signature, just a paragraph written with the same venom I had seen in her eyes that night she came to my door. It was a bitter, baseless complaint accusing me of slander, harassment, neighborhood disruption, and a dozen violations she invented out of thin air. Every sentence dripped with spite. It wasn't a legal threat. It wasn't even coherent enough to scare me. It was simply her last attempt at control, a desperate reach from someone who had lost every form of power except the illusion of it. Reading it didn't make me angry the way she probably hoped it would. Instead, it left me with something sadder, something heavier. After everything she had done, after all the fear she had manufactured, this letter was the final reminder of how deeply she believed authority came from intimidation, not responsibility. She couldn't understand why her tactics failed in the end, because she never understood what real strength looked like. For a few seconds, I considered writing back, a firm response, a warning, something that would close the loop. But as I stood at the kitchen counter, holding that trembling piece of paper, I realized responding would only keep me tied to the storm she created. She wanted engagement. She wanted the fight, and I was done giving her space in my life. So I folded the letter once, calmly, and placed it in a drawer, not to revisit, but to remind myself how far this community had come. Not every battle deserves a return strike. Some battles end when you choose to step away. The rest of the day, I found myself reflecting not only on Karen, but on everything this ordeal had revealed about people, power, and dignity. Harold's roses reminded me that even small acts of care matter. The neighbors who shared their stories taught me that silence can be just as damaging as injustice. And Karen herself, ironically, showed me that authority without compassion is nothing more than a weapon waiting to be misused. If this experience taught me anything, it's that treating people with dignity is not a luxury or a kindness. It's a responsibility. It's the foundation of a community worth living in. And it's something no title, no position, no set of bylaws can replace. As I share this chapter of my life, I want to hear from you too. If you've ever dealt with an HOA gone wrong, a neighbor who crossed the line, or someone who abused power just because they could, share your story. Your voice matters. And if you want more stories about standing up against injustice, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video so others can find the strength to stand up too. I thought that was the end of it. The investigation into Karen would continue, the neighborhood would rebuild, and life would finally settle back into something peaceful. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe without tension. But the universe wasn't finished with me yet. Just as I sat down on my porch, enjoying the quiet, I heard footsteps approaching. A man I had never seen before, tall, nervous, holding a stack of papers, stopped at the edge of my driveway. He looked at me with hesitant eyes and said, "You're Mark, right? I heard what you did. I need your help." And just like that, another story began.